Hello, my dear viewers. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of personality. Today, I would like to reflect with you on the topic, the essential and the secondary, setting priorities. In childhood, it was necessary for us to be focused on the reactions of significant adults towards us. The way they treated us determined the amount of benefits we received, and we remain with this mindset. It seems to us that we are focused on the external, on how others react to us. Even the questions you ask are about how to behave correctly. How should you act if you are threatened? How should you behave in conflicts? What should you say during a conflict? How do you defend your external boundaries? You see, all these questions are about influencing external reality, about what seems to be happening outside. But people don't ask questions about their inner world. And that's why they mistakenly believe that they are too focused on the external, although in reality the external only interests them in terms of getting what they want. Some kind of optimal, the best possible reaction to it. And today I would like to separate these two spaces with you, what happens outside and what happens inside. Because what happens inside is the factor that gives meaning. In other words, our inner state will completely influence the external. And focusing primarily on the external aspects should always come second. Let's now recall a very common situation from everyday life where someone forcefully compelled you to do things entirely their way. And if you firmly refuse to comply, they then threaten to complain about you to a higher authority figure, for example, your direct management or supervisor. If you are a lawyer, imagine your client pressuring you to sign a contract on terms that benefit them. If you don't agree, they say, I'll complain. Or for example, you are a doctor and someone is pressuring you to write a certain prescription, or you are a psychologist and your client is forcing you to treat them in a specific way. And they say that, for instance, you are causing them pain if you don't behave as they want. In other words, any situation involving this kind of blackmail. At such moments, our focus tends to shift outward. It seems to us that we are thinking about how to respond to the person in front of us. But at the same time, a series of events is unfolding within our inner world. In this illustration, I have separated external C events from internal C events. A person may think they are processing information about the external event, while in reality their inner world is starting to overflow with emotions. Now let's imagine that we pause this event, and what happens to us in just a few seconds, we will try to stretch out as if we have stopped time, and all the events in our inner world are unfolding much, much more slowly. In other words, our personality under the influence of an external event is thrown off balance. A certain undeniable tension frequently arises within us if we do not consciously pay close attention to the powerful emotions that inevitably arise within us. Our very psyche, our fundamental innate instinct for self-preservation and well-being, begins to significantly amplify these intense emotions so that they become sufficiently large and undeniably prominent enough that they can no longer be easily ignored or dismissed. In other words, the earlier a person is able to distinguish between external and internal events in their perception, the less intense their emotions will be. We are not taught to pay attention to the events happening in our inner world, what is happening inside me right now. All trainings are focused specifically on external behavior. We, on the other hand, will turn inward. When a person is threatened, our instinct for self-preservation will, in any case, perceive it as danger. If an emotion is not recognized, as I mentioned earlier, it will begin to intensify. And this red circle precisely symbolizes the intensification of emotions within. The more we ignore what is happening inside us, the stronger this intensification will be. The escalation of our emotional response to what is happening depends both on the structure of our personality and the specifics of our psyche. Some people have a more excitable psyche, others less so, but there will always be a reaction to a threat. Even if your psyche is not labile and is quite stable, this process will still be triggered in your inner world. In other words, a threat has occurred. Many people believe they are processing their thoughts, when in fact it is their emotion that generates these thoughts. Our emotional response is much faster than our mind. When we first came into this world, our emotions were primary, and only later did thinking, understanding, and naming emerge. So, if I truly don't notice that my emotional state is gradually building up, I will inevitably feel a profound loss of control over the entire situation if I simply cannot adequately explain to myself precisely what is actually happening. It's as if my very own mind is constantly running after my intense emotions, thereby significantly amplifying the dramatization of the circumstances. In other words, a moment of catastrophizing occurs. The consequences of such a threat seem more and more frightening to us. In reality, our emotions are intensifying, but it feels like we are thinking about external things, when in fact we are processing our growing emotion. At this stage, the person is not yet highly emotional. They hear these words, "I will file a complaint against you." At this stage, the person already understands that if someone complains about them to management, management will create problems for them. At this stage, management will create problems for me and will probably fire me. At this stage, I will be fired, I won't be able to find a job, and I will die of hunger. All of these thoughts appear after the emotions. In other words, the emotion comes first, and the thought explains it. A person who is left alone with a growing emotion and cannot put it into words feels even more afraid. That is, when we come up with an explanation for our feeling. For example, I might experience intense fear if something falls, and my emotion spikes to the maximum, especially if I am home alone. And in order to explain this emotional reaction, my mind invents a story that there is a killer there and that I am about to die because of him. So you see, first an emotion of a certain intensity arises, and then an idea appears that is just as frightening as the emotion I experienced. This triangle symbolizes the escalation of emotionality if that emotionality is not addressed. For example, someone says to me, "I will file a complaint against you." And at that moment, I need to split my awareness into two lines of perception. One line of perception is the words the person is saying. The second line of perception is the processes happening in my inner world. That is, I feel an emotional surge. I realize that my emotions are starting to intensify, and soon I will have thoughts that try to explain the magnitude of these emotions. When I realize that the thought that I might get fired and starve to death is simply an explanation for my excessive emotionality, I don't treat it as a factual matter. I genuinely don't try to base my everyday behavior on these specific conclusions, primarily because I fully understand that these particular conclusions are entirely a product of my own inner world, rather than being a reflection of the actual objective situation itself. A person who doesn't understand all these processes, that is, someone who isn't used to making the events of their inner world the main focus, begins to react to these words based on this emotional charge. It often happens that with such a reactive emotional response, the psyche may not be fully able to adequately withstand this immense pressure at all, potentially leading to significant psychological strain. As you can see in the last illustration, the red circle is larger than the black one. That is, the black circle symbolizes the amount of tension. In other words, it shows how much tension we are able to withstand. If our emotions break through both the floor and the ceiling, at that moment we might simply shut down. For example, when a person receives a text message like this, instead of reflecting on it, In other words, they are unable to process the actual facts. Their psyche instantly creates this excessive tension, and it can completely overwhelm them. I think you've probably seen how individuals can really shut down during moments of intense stress, that is to say, during certain significant events that have a profoundly strong and lasting impact on them. In such situations, we typically observe two distinct reactions that are fundamentally opposite to each other. A person can either express excessive emotion outwardly, that is, this reactive tension that arises is released externally, like this. In other words, the event in terms of its threat is equal to this kind of emotional outburst. But because the psyche is already accelerated, it starts to process it not as blackmail from this person, but as a threat to its own life. And then the emotional response to this person can be just as strong. I think you've often found yourself in situations where your emotional reaction was greater than the actual threat posed by the outside world, haven't you? In other words, excessive emotionality. Later, when you reflected on it, you realized you could have responded differently. You could have reacted more calmly. You didn't have to shout. You could have sorted things out. And this regret about inappropriate behavior arises precisely because there is no observation of the process within your inner world. In other words, these things are not prioritized. The psyche does not consider them important. So, it could be either excessive emotionality, disproportionate to the actual problem, or perhaps a complete shutdown. What does shutdown mean? When a person shuts down, they might escape into social media or watching movies. And if someone is a professional escapist, then in this state of running away from their own feelings, they may not be there constantly, but quite often. But if I truly realize that my intense emotional agitation or being completely wound up about something is in fact my very own internal product, a complex process that I consciously or even unconsciously create within myself, then I can truly begin to effectively calm myself down and regain a sense of inner peace. In other words, all my attention and effort are directed not toward finding an answer, but toward soothing myself. So if I notice this emotional reaction, it doesn't escalate. But if it has escalated, if it managed to build up, then I try to return to a more or less balanced state. You see, I am not saying that a person should not have an emotional response to a threat. Right now, I am only discussing with you the intensity of that emotional response. Because excessive emotionality either shuts us down or we start behaving inappropriately in ways that later make us feel ashamed and tormented by guilt. This feeling of guilt arises from an inappropriate reaction, specifically guilt over an inadequate response. If the reaction was appropriate, there will be no feeling of guilt. That is, it's as if we intuitively know the truth. And when this feeling of guilt arises, all our inner dialogues begin, where we replay the same event over and over, how it could have been done better, who is to blame, is it me or him, me or him, me or him? In other words, a person tries to shift responsibility for their own emotional reaction onto someone else. At this moment, we are not discussing the moral or ethical standards of the other person's behavior. We're not touching on that yet. We've set it aside. We've pressed pause, stretched out time, and focused on what is happening inside ourselves. In other words, we've made the events of our inner world the priority. When I have reached a state of balance, it is at this point of awareness and understanding that I finally begin to think. In other words, your ability to think is only possible at this point. At the previous point, there are no resources available for thinking. The entire psyche is overwhelmed with emotion. When we talk about the priority of the inner world, it is important to understand that much of our behavior, which we cannot explain why it happened the way it did, depends precisely on our emotionality. When a person ignores their own emotionality, the events happening in their inner world, they do not understand, for example, why they are unable to perform in public. because before a performance, this same reactive process takes place. And many people hire consultants for rhetoric or public speaking, but do nothing about their inner world. As a result, after their performances, they experience severe fatigue because they have to suppress all of that emotionality. And then the person's speech becomes hollow, it is empty. Many people, for example, when they are reading various texts, often react quite emotionally to certain specific words or phrases. That is, the text is written about one thing. But because I reacted emotionally to certain parts and didn't notice it, I start processing not the entire meaning of the text, but only what caught my attention. I think you've noticed this with videos, especially if you have the habit of watching them a second time. So when you watched it the first time, something caught your attention, a process was triggered, and you started processing not what I was saying outwardly, but what you reacted to. And because of this, the rest of the meaning is missed. It's as if you don't hear it. A similar process can be observed when, for example, a person starts telling something and can't finish their thought. It's as if he starts telling you about one thing and then suddenly drifts off into a completely different topic. In other words, he follows his emotion internally, like chasing will-o'-the-wisps without realizing it. Or, for example, you need to leave. You start to feel some anxiety inside, or you need to go somewhere, and you begin to focus on doing things that are completely unimportant. And you react emotionally thinking it's important right now, and you can't even consider whether it's truly a priority at this moment. Is it really more important to do this than, for example, tidying up at home, or say, going to work or catching your train? In other words, for the personality, all these inner events should take first place. You see how it influences our behavior. No matter how much a person is taught to respond intelligently in conflict situations, if they don't understand their inner world, that inner world will still force them to behave, in a sense, inappropriately. Or the person may simply shut down because they can't withstand the tension they've accumulated within themselves. All the confusion of thoughts, the inability to speak, the inability to be disciplined, the inability to achieve goals, all of this arises precisely because a person follows their emotions, follows what feels good or seems important, simply because it is more emotionally charged, and they are unaware of this. That's the topic. We have a wide range of videos on this channel covering various themes and ideas. Take a look if you're interested. They're also about the skill of communicating with other people. Overall, my videos are for those who want to gain a deeper understanding of themselves, and for anyone who wants to gain a deeper insight into what happens in their interactions with others. So don't forget to subscribe and like the video. And I would like to ask you to write about what happens inside you, for example, when there is a threat of a relationship breaking off with someone. Let's say it's, for example, a subordinate who wants to leave you, or someone you've hired, like a nanny, or even someone who is consulting you. Try to describe this entire process in your inner world on your own, and separate it into the external events by their significance and your own emotional reaction. You may choose a different process if you wish, but it is very important to me that you go through this separation. I'll say goodbye for now and see you next time.